Welcome back to A Good Run podcast with Daniel Feldman. I'm Asher Feldman, and this is episode 8, the campaigns of 1969 through 1970. On this podcast, Dan and I discuss 3 different campaigns. First, the tail end of the John Lindsay successful reelection campaign for mayor, as well as Dan's involvement in 2 somewhat less successful campaigns, one for an assembly seat in New York State, and the other for the Democratic primary for the governorship of New York State. Make sure you stay through the end of the podcast. We'll do a quick little preview of a couple episodes to come. And remember, you can reach out to us on any of the channels that we've been talking about before. Twitter, our blog, via email, and any of the podcast apps that you use. Anyways, thanks so much for those of you who have stuck with us through our quick election season break. I hope you enjoy this podcast episode, and we'll see you guys real soon. Thanks so much. Welcome back to A Good Run podcast with Daniel Feldman. I'm Asher Feldman, and thanks for sticking with us through our mini break during the political season in the United States. On the last episode, we were talking about John Lindsay's reelection campaign in 1969 and Dan's involvement. So on this podcast, we're probably going to take like a quick post-mortem of that campaign and then move on into the many multifaceted ways that your political career went from there. So, Dan, welcome back to the podcast. How you doing?
Oh, okay, thanks.
Good.
Good to be back.
So, you talked with Leah in great detail about the Lindsay campaign. I'd love to be just kind of like caught up with how you were feeling, I guess, as the campaign wound down, the days that were immediately preceding and the days that immediately followed the election. What was kind of going through your mind? How was it impacting you? How had your experience in your first like real influential campaign gone? What were you thinking back then?
Well, I had my feelings were somewhat in conflict in that I really liked Lindsay. I mean, if you knew the guy, it was impossible not to like him.
Right.
But I had some mixed feelings about the campaign in 2 respects. One, the stuff we were working on, the defensive operations, were kind of almost at the margin of dirty tricks. I mean, I can't swear that we did any of these things, but I suspect we did. Losing a contact lens in the middle of a busy polling place where your opponent is going to do well to slow things down, or kicking the plug out of the machine so that you have to wait for an electrician to put it back in. I mean, these things we talked about. Whether we actually did them, I don't know, but I was feeling uneasy enough about that so that I wasn't happy with my role in the campaign. On the other hand, I was delighted that Lindsay won. It was he was losing for a good part of the campaign.
Yeah.
Actually, there's one incident that I really enjoyed that helped him, as far as everybody can imagine, which was that a very astonishing thing happened in 1969, about a month before the November election. And that is, we had a baseball team in New York. We had a few baseball teams. But we had one baseball team in New York that was fairly new, that had developed a reputation for being extraordinarily incompetent. And that was the New York Mets. But in 1969, a miracle happened. The Mets won the World Series. I mean, they did it again in 1986, but 1969, it was almost inconceivable that this would happen.
They had been in last place almost every year prior.
Yes,
they were founded, I believe, in 1962.
Yeah.
And for the first 6 years of their existence, they were last place.
Right. And they were a notoriously terrible baseball team. And they won the series in 1969. Now, New York City was really happy about this. Happy is only an understatement. Right. Delirious. It was astonishing. And there were those who speculated that the good feeling about the city may have contributed to Lindsay's victory. And there was a particular press conference in which he was asked about this very theory. And Lindsay's response was, that is ridiculous. I give no credence whatsoever to that theory. It's utterly absurd. And if you don't believe me, ask Deputy Mayor Hodges. Now, of course, Gil Hodges, for those who may not know, was the manager of the New York Mets at the time.
Right.
So we all felt pretty good about that. How much of a role it played is obviously unclear, but there was a, Nixon had been elected in '68, and the strength of the sort of the right wing reaction to Lindsay in New York in '69 was substantial. I mean, that's, Mario Porcicino was getting a lot of votes, and right wing Democrat, and John Markey, who, as I've mentioned before, I later learned to be a wonderful, highly intelligent, sophisticated human being. Nonetheless, he ran as a conservative Republican, and so when it looked like Lindsay was losing, it looked like this sort of right-wing wave was going to even sweep over New York. When Lindsay won, during a Nixon presidency, this was very heartening to those of us on the progressive side of things, especially in that era, which was, the Vietnam era, when students and young people like myself were very passionate about ending the war and civil rights movement and so on and so forth. So Lindsay's reelection was, whatever qualms I may have felt about the particular aspect of the campaign I was involved in, Lindsay's reelection was enormously gratifying.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. So that's an interesting kind of dichotomy to kind of pose. Obviously, the country is going one way. Mm-hmm. New York makes its stand, I guess, by re-electing John Lindsay. Right. Was that kind of thing... I mean, I feel like now, at least, it's relatively common that big cities are free from any kind of political wave. Like, if they're particularly liberal, they can continue to elect particularly liberal leaders, even in a time of a Republican wave of political support.
Yeah, well, that was not so clear at that point, right. At least not in New York City.
But that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. But remember, Lindsay, he won. He didn't get all the votes. Right. I mean, Porcicino still got a decent chunk of the votes.
So then, in the days after the election, Lindsay wins, Porcicino gets plenty of support.
Yeah.
What's the general feeling? Are you guys feeling like vindicated? Are you feeling
yes, definitely, no question about it.
Okay.
I may have mentioned to you at one point that there was actually a betting pool in which we had to predict the actual number of votes, the number, not just the percentage. So you're predicting percentage and turnout, basically. Right. And it's there were 50 people in the pool. We each put in $1, and as far as I can remember, it is the only competitive betting situation that I ever won in my life.
Do you remember like what the order of magnitude of votes was?
Yeah, it was something like, if I remember correctly, 800,000. Maybe I don't know, somewhere maybe 1 million votes for Lindsay, 800,000 votes for Porcicino, maybe 400,000 for Markey. That's just very ballpark. I don't remember the actual numbers.
Do you remember, by any chance, the kind of turnout, the overall enthusiasm in the city for an election like that?
Yeah, mayoral races in New York City generally get pretty decent turnout.
And in that one in particular?
Yeah, it was a good turnout. I don't think it was an all-time record, but it was a very substantial turnout.
Okay. Yeah. So in the days afterwards, what are you thinking? What do you think the next steps are? What are you learning from your experience?
Well, first of all, I'm now going. My leave of absence is ending. I'm going back to the fellowship.
Right.
But I don't remember. I do remember again feeling uneasy about the role I played, but I don't remember anything particular about what I didn't think it had any particular implications for me personally, except to show that progressives can sometimes win.
Right. I mean, that must be heartening, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
yes.
Certainly.
But I mean, it was, the conflict wasn't over. You had people, from the outer borough, particularly from Queens at that time, who continued to, fly the the conservative flag, and I mean quite literally in one respect. There was a Vietnam kind of a moratorium day when there was student marches and so forth, and Lindsay, in solidarity with the students, had the flag over City Hall lowered, and this sort of wild city council member from Queens named Matthew Troy climbed up onto the roof of City Hall and personally raised the flag again, as a sort of anti-war measure.
That's wild.
Matty later became the Democratic county leader of Queens, and I will, so later podcast, I'll talk about my personal interaction with him. He was, like many such people, a personally charming guy, but a wild character, and became county leader. So I mean, and the hard hats, the construction workers, these were very much sort of pro-Vietnam War people, and it may not have been so much that they loved the war in Vietnam, but I think they were reacting against the perception that these college students who were more privileged than they, were taking a position that seemed to them to be, anti-military. I mean, a lot of these people had served in the armed forces, and I think it was a kind of a sort of a resentment of the demographics of the people who were in the anti-war movement, that in some ways reflects some of the recent politics, where a lot of Trump voters just seem to, in some ways, possibly understandably, resenting what they see as the superior elitist attitude of their opposition here. But that was true then.
Yeah.
But it was very much true in New York City too.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you go back to the Urban Fellowship program,
right,
colored by this kind of experience.
Right.
Remind me, are other members of the Urban Fellowship class that year also taking leave of absences too?
No, I think one or two did. I think my Dave O'Connor was a very close friend, and possibly, I don't think John Meininger took another couple weeks with me in a different campaign, but I don't think he took a leave for that. Maybe Dave.
Okay.
I don't remember if anybody else did. I'm not even sure Dave did.
So you're coming back to the program, obviously, with this experience.
Yeah, I mean, I am, after all, the only member of my class who ran for office.
Right, fair enough.
There was an urban fellow a number of years later, Warren Wilhelm, who ran for office too, but he changed his name to de Blasio.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Right.
So, returning to the Urban Fellowship program,
right.
How are you feeling? What? I mean, obviously, the kind of experience that you just had is not necessarily something that's baked into this brand spanking new Urban Fellowship program.
No, of course not. Right.
What are you thinking is next?
Well, I don't remember. I came back to Lance Liebman, and I don't remember what else I did for him. But after a few weeks, we both decided, and I'm still friends with Lance, how many years later, but we both decided that I had pretty much I'd gotten the experience in his office. And so we agreed that I would try a different office. Mm-hmm. And so I was on my way back I went back to, actually Lance's office was in 51 Chambers, which is in the middle of Chambers Street. And I went back to 250 Broadway, which was where I had been working as an Urban Corps intern the previous year, out of the office of Deputy Mayor Costello. And now I went back there to do this project in which I was supposed to both predict and prevent various disasters in New York City. And I successfully predicted the first horrible subway crash and did not prevent it. So my impact in that role was considerably less than with Lance, where I actually created a new bureau in the city government. But it was interesting work, intellectually very interesting.
It's a tall order to try to do that.
Yeah. But then I actually took another, in 1970, at some point in the spring semester of 70, I got involved in another campaign. I don't remember exactly when it was. I don't know if it's in this podcast. I think it's in a later thing. But we'll get to that another time. But the Bob Morgenthau's campaign for governor, which is, I don't know, is that a later thing?
Yeah, it is, but let's talk about it. I mean,
All right.
it's clearly the next like touch point, benchmark, like bookmark in your memory. So
yeah, it is. I think John Meininger had been working for Bob Morgan. John was another urban fellow in my class.
Yeah.
Bob Morgenthau had been a great U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, which, as you may know, is like the premier office in the country. Bob was a nephew of the Treasury Secretary Morgenthau and Roosevelt. I mean, he came from a very distinguished family and so forth. And the grandson, I think, of Morgenthau, who was ambassador to Turkey at the beginning of the 20th century. Anyway, but Bob is a really nice guy. And he had been U.S. attorney, but when Nixon got elected, he fired him as U.S. attorney because, well, the president can do that. He wants to put in his own appointment. And so Lindsay hired Bob as like a deputy mayor for criminal justice.
Okay.
But Bob decided that he wanted to run for governor. And John was an urban fellow assigned to Bob's office. And John asked me if I wanted to get involved, and I said yes. And John and I were assigned to do upstate petitions. That is, there were two other candidates in the race. Justice Goldberg, former Justice Arthur Goldberg, and Supreme Court Justice, who had been also appointed subsequently by Lyndon Johnson ambassador to the United Nations, and Howard Samuels, who was a very wealthy, politically progressive guy from upstate who had a lot of money. And so Bob decided to get into the race. If you don't have the support of the official Democratic organization, then there's still a way to get on the primary ballot. That is, if you have the support, there's a Democratic convention at a certain point prior to the primary where they designate you as the official candidate and you automatically go on the ballot. But if you're not going to get the designation, and Bob knew he wouldn't because Goldberg was going to get it, you can petition. You need, as I recall, it's about 10,000 petitions statewide, but also you need at least a certain number, 100, 200, something like that, from each of at least 51 counties in the state. New York has 62 or 62, I believe, counties. But you need to get petitions from at least some from almost all of the counties, not quite all. Many of these counties have very few people.
Do they all have at least a couple hundred people?
Yeah.
Okay.
But, it's sometimes a pretty small number.
Yeah.
John and I were assigned upstate petition gathering.
Okay.
And so I took another leave. This was a brief one. It was only a week or two. And we traveled around. We drove. We went upstate New York. And ringing doorbells. We were given lists of who the registered Democrats were, so we drive up to their homes and ask them if they'd sign the petition. And quite inadvertently, entirely without intending to, within a week or so, I sounded like this. "Excuse me, sir, are you a registered Democrat in this county?" That was the speech pattern up there. And I gradually absorbed it.
Right.
It was quite interesting. We actually found ourselves in a restaurant bar in a town called Auburn, New York, very, very far west in the state, when we overheard people at a nearby table talking about Assemblyman Michaels and how they were not going to support him in the next election. I didn't really know what they were talking about, but this was the Democratic county committee of that town.
And their meeting was in a bar.
It was an informal meeting.
Oh, okay.
And Michaels, I later learned, was the Democrat who switched his vote. He was the deciding vote to legalize abortion in New York prior to Roe v. Wade.
Oh, wow.
As a matter of conscience. He knew he would lose the seat on that basis, and he did it anyway. And we were there overhearing that conversation.
That's amazing.
Years later, I wrote an article on ethical decision-making in public policy in which I talked about Michaels in this regard. And I guess I sent, somehow he saw it. I don't remember if I sent it to him or not. Anyway, he was in his 80s at that point, and he wrote me a note saying, I didn't know that anybody remembered me, and because I had presented him as a hero of ethics, which he was.
That's amazing.
But anyway, Morgenthau was a great man, and he later was elected Manhattan DA, where he served for like 30 years or more even, forever.
Right.
He's close to 100 now, and he's still practicing law actively.
That's amazing.
But Bob looks very serious. And in addition to the upstate petitions, I did some petition work for him in Brooklyn, too, on Montague Street, which is a very... Court and Montague is a very busy intersection. I was collecting signatures for him there. And I'll never forget, one fellow stopped me and said, look, I know you're working for Bob Morgenthau, and I like him, and I'd like him to win. But please pass on some advice to him from me. When he's on TV in an interview, the expression on his face should not be the same expression he would be wearing if he were at that moment undergoing a proctological examination.
So not John Lindsay.
No.
Yeah.
Bob looked very serious, and he had this very serious and dignified demeanor. In person, he was a charming guy. He dropped out of the race because it became clear that Goldberg was going to massacre him.
But you got him on the ballot.
He would have been on the ballot,
Okay.
But he dropped out. He never was on the ballot.
He never even got that chance.
He understood he was getting clobbered.
Got it.
By Arthur Goldberg. Arthur Goldberg was such a bad candidate himself that when he was running against Rockefeller, he started out with a big lead in the polls. By the time the campaign was over, he got clobbered. The press, I don't remember which journalist said it, but it became a widely known quotation. They said if Goldberg had campaigned another 2 weeks, Rockefeller would have won Canada. He was also a terrible candidate, but Morgenthau was worse.
Oh, gosh.
But there was a crew that had been assistant U.S. attorneys under Morgenthau, Paul Rooney, Paul Galvani, and Elkin Abramowitz, who I kind of worked with during the campaign. And Elkin Abramowitz lived in Port Washington, where we lived for a number of years. We were friendly with him there, active in our synagogue. Paul Rooney, I stayed friends with for many, many years thereafter. Galvani, I kind of lost touch with. But so all these people, I became friends, and Morgenthau himself became a friend. There's also, you may have to edit the following story for the radio, but when Morgenthau dropped out, he said to the press, look, I don't want to keep repeating my concession statement, so I'm just going to record something. And if you call this phone number and dial it, you'll be able to hear the statement.
Mm-hmm.
And we did. And there in Morgenthau's very kind of, what's the right word, is highly educated. He speaks as someone with a kind of a great
enunciator,
right?
Yeah.
Very kind of upper class background. Right. And the quote was, "Fuck you, Arthur. Fuck you, Arthur." Anyway,
man. So going from Lindsay's campaign back to the Urban Fellowship to Morgenthau's campaign,
right.
Like, what? Your head must have been on a swivel. Like, what's going on?
Well, but I was really enjoying this stuff.
Yeah.
I like campaigns. I know I had some qualms about the Lindsay campaign, but
right.
as when I was in high school, I did, local assemblyman's campaign. And I handed out leaflets for Stevenson and for Kennedy,
mm-hmm.
and I guess Johnson. But this was, serious level stuff. This was technical, professional political work. So I was delighted to be able to do it.
Yeah.
And certainly it was one thing to be setting up the PVB, which was very practical. The other project I had, this predicting and trying to prevent emergencies, really turned out to be a very academic kind of intellectual exercise. It wasn't practical.
Right.
So the which was fine with me, but the opportunity to do very practical campaign stuff was also very attractive to me.
Yeah.
So
are you like the Morgenthau campaign ends early?
Yes, very early. Quite early.
Are you now itching to go to the next campaign? Or are you itching to campaign for yourself?
No, I wasn't thinking of campaigning for myself.
Not at this point.
No,
Okay.
no, not at all. No, I wasn't. I mean, I certainly imagined that I would run at some point,
Right.
but I had nothing specific in mind at that point.
So how much time left in school did you have at that point?
Well, enough time to do a little work for Norman Adler in the Bronx.
Yeah. Let's hear it.
Norman was a professor of mine in my junior year, and Norman was one of the best teachers I've ever encountered. He was very funny, very colorful. He when he made a point, it stuck in your head. You remembered it, and his stories were just fabulous. Two stories about his grandfather I remember to this day. He said his grandfather was a very, very partisan Democrat and also kind of a fierce guy. But every, X number of years, maybe 8 or 12 years, he would go to a Republican convention. And the family was always kind of too afraid to ask him why. Because he was so. But eventually when he got older, mellowed a little bit, they said, Pops, you're such a Democrat. Why would you show up at a Republican convention? And his response was, to renew my disgust. The other story what he told of his grandfather, which was indicative of the nature of politics in small New England. Apparently his grandfather lived in a small town in New England somewhere. And there were like, 11 Republicans and 8 Democrats. And everybody knew who voted how. So one year, the grandfather was in the hospital at the time of the election. There were no absentee ballots, I suppose, at that point. So he sees the voting results, and it's 11 Republicans and 8 Democrats. Now, in a town like this, the guy who runs the grocery store also is the postman. He also runs the election, So he goes to the postman and says, "This is great. Who's the new Democrat?" The grocery store guy says, Jeb, we knew how you'd vote. So things may have been less acrimonious in those days.
Yeah, slightly, ever so slightly. Right. So this is a professor of yours?
Great professor of mine. And Bob Abrams had just been elected Bronx Borough president in the fall. And so Bob had been a member of the assembly. And so when that happened, when there's a vacancy, the governor can call a special election to fill the seat. I mean, you could wait till the fall, but ordinarily you don't. You call a special election to fill the seat, and the governor did that. And so there was an opening, and Norman lived at that point in the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, and decided to run for the assembly. And I was, like Norman a lot, and so I went up to help get petition signatures for him. And Norman and his wife, his then wife, Madeline, he gave us instructions on how to do the petitioning and so forth. And we went door to door getting signatures, which of course, that was the first time I think I did that. I guess it was the first time I was old enough. I'm not even sure I was old enough. I don't think I was old enough. I think I went with someone who was older, but they felt less articulate or whatever. So I wasn't the witness. I would talk to the voter, but the person with me would actually would witness the petitions.
So to be clear, you had to be 21 in order to be the official witness.
The voting age hadn't been lowered to 18 at that time.
Right.
So,
but you were the articulate one of the crew.
Right. So we were going door to door in these buildings, ringing doorbells and getting signatures. And Norman, I think, did not. Now, what I learned, which is a basic element of politics in New York, is that it's never enough to get the legally required number of signatures. You have to get, the rule of thumb is 3 times that number. Because for one reason or other, a lot of signatures will be knocked out. Now, the signatures you get door to door generally are not knocked out. But ordinarily, you get some signatures door to door because there you're going with a list of who the registered Democrats are with addresses. But you get some signatures on street corners, and there you ask people, as I did upstate, are you a registered Democrat? But they don't always get it right.
Yeah.
And so, there's a technical problem, they don't write the address correctly. The opposition can go through your signatures and knock out the ones that don't meet, that are not legally valid.
Yeah.
And so the rule of thumb is 3 times the number. And apparently the opposition was able to knock out enough of Norman's signatures, so he didn't make it. And a fellow named Alan Hochberg got the Democratic nomination, was elected to the assembly, and was later convicted of some kind of fraud and went to prison and had a stroke in prison. Terrible story.
So this, just to kind of like pause there a second. I mean, how big is this assembly district that you're?
Well, the assembly district usually, when I was later elected, it was about 120,000 people. This was, I don't remember exactly. It was between 100,000 and 120,000 people.
And so Norman is like just a professor. What was his background? How are you selling Norman to the people of this Bronx assembly district?
Norman had already been in New York City government. I mean, he wasn't that much older than me, but he'd done something like, he wasn't an urban fellow because it didn't exist yet, but he had some kind of job in city government. He had some kind of government experience. Later on, he became immensely politically powerful as the political director for District Council 37 of the AFL-CIO, which was basically municipal workers under a very brilliant and powerful labor leader named Victor Gottbaum. And Norman was the political director, who then used DC 37 to elect enormous numbers of state legislators, primarily Democrats, but some Republicans, which then benefited DC 37 very much. So Norman's a very brilliant guy.
So on the spectrum of the candidates or on the campaigns that you had worked up into and through that time,
right?
Is there a through line emerging for you? Is there something that you're learning each time?
Well, of course, I was learning some of the technical aspects of campaigns.
Yeah. And were the minutia, like, was that interesting to you? Were you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know if you think it's worthwhile for the podcast, but there was what I thought was a really good poem about low level political work written by a friend of mine, who I still talk to occasionally.
Yeah, it's up on the Tales from the Sausage Factory blog.
Yeah,
if
so
you guys want to
can read it.
Go check that out.
But it captures, if you want to really capture the spirit of that kind of, soldiering. You're not running the campaign. You're not a manager. You're just a foot soldier.
Yeah. It spoke to you.
It really did.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, this is great setup for what's to come next for you, for the podcast, obviously in the history of New York politics.
Well, the next campaign, which I guess we'll talk about in a later podcast, was not the congressional race. It was a lower level campaign. The congressional race was 1972, but there was a lower level race in 1970 that I played a very significant role in.
And whose campaign is that?
A young lady who ran for Democratic district leader in the 44th AD named Elizabeth Holtzman. So. Yeah,
and that's going to be a big story. Yeah. So we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And yeah, tune in next time to A Good Run, and we will be back with the story of Liz Holtzman and so many more. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good couple of weeks, and we'll see you soon.